All right, we are going to talk about social groups and social stratification this week. I think the social stratification piece, for me at least, is a bit more enlightening, I might say, for us to understand what's happening with people's ability to access resources. However, that's for next week. What the chapter of this title is, chapter 9, is social groups and social stratification. So we're working on, as usual, half a chapter, and we're working on the social groups, the first part of the chapter this week. But what the three areas that will be addressed in this whole chapter are social groups, which is we're going to find out what they are, how they vary cross-culturally, and that's for this week. And then the rest of the chapter discusses, which will begin next week, social stratification, that means the layering of people, like strata, if you've taken geology, layers. And what is it, how it affects cultures and societies, and then a piece on civil society at the very end of the chapter, which are groups outside of the government that support various aspects of policy and institutions and life. Okay, so today, beginning and with this section, this first section on social groups, your chapter begins with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French philosopher, and he traveled around America in the late 1800s, or I'm sorry, early 1800s. So not quite a long time ago, and not that long after the United States was established. And he characterized America as what he called a nation of joiners. And that was in the early 1800s. So he saw it as that aspect of our selves, our collective selves, the personality of America, as something that set us apart from Europeans, this idea of joining groups and organizations and clubs and, that type of thing. So that's there because obviously it relates to various social groups. So for this chapter, we're going to look at both non-kin groups and kin groups. And we're also going to look at microculture formation. Now, microcultures are such things as race, ethnicity, indigeneity, for indigenous peoples, gender, age, institutions like prisons and retirement homes. They certainly have their own microcultures, prisons and retirement homes. So does the military, for example. And how, that's one thing we're going to look at. Those are the various things we're going to look at. And then we're also going to look at and explore how microcultures shape group identity and relationships among different groups in relation to, and here's a key part, hierarchy and power. Because all groups have some form of hierarchy and power. Who's in charge, who's at the top, et cetera, et cetera. Who's head of the household is, that type of thing. And then the last section we'll look at is the concept of civil society. So starting with social groups, the definition is a cluster of people beyond the domestic unit who are usually related in ways other than kinship. And there's two basic categories of social groups. There's the primary group, and that's a group of people who meet on a face-to-face basis. So a club you belong to, pre-COVID, where there were meetings of that club or group, or a book club or whatever. Now the book clubs are all online or not, I guess I could say they're still a primary group because you're meeting face-to-face in a sense through Zooming and that type of thing. That's a primary group. The secondary group is a group of people who identify with one another on some basis, but that you may never meet one another personally. So you may belong to an organization and you may pay dues to it, but it's a big organization. And you never, say the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, or some other organization you belong to. So members of all social groups have sense of rights and responsibilities to the groups. You gain rights from being part of the group, and then you have responsibilities to the group. And so with the primary group, obviously those rights and responsibilities are more there. There's more direct accountability for membership expectations, what they are. Maybe paying dues. It may be expecting to fill some office every few years as secretary, or whatever. There's a variety of different accountabilities. Showing up to meetings, that type of thing. So how do modes of livelihood affect social groups? Well, here we are again. Modes of livelihoods are obviously affect practically everything since you've learned about them. And as you might imagine, if you really think about this and understand what social groups are, the greatest variety and complexity of social groups is found among the highest, the ones furthest to the right on that chart, and the most complex societies, agricultural and industrial digital. And part of that is because those other, like foragers, for instance, they're a more mobile population, and they're less likely, and pastoralists, the same thing, they're more mobile, and they're more likely to develop, not to develop long-term social groups beyond their small kin groups, because they move around so much. So there are prominent groups in the foragers and pastoralists, but what they are primarily is what are called age groups and age sets. And they're people who go through life, depending on a few years, it's an age set, together. They go through initiation rites, puberty rites, adulthood, all of those things. They kind of march along together. Interestingly, the Japanese have a similar kind of thing where for hiring in corporations, they'll hire people from a whole class of a university in many cases, and then they go through their whole careers in an age set together as they are promoted through the company and that type of thing. So how do age sets, or I'm sorry, social groups differ from friendship? Well, friendship is a form of a social group, and they're close social, it can be a small group, 2 people, but they're close social ties between at least 2 people, and they're very usually quite informal, as you know. They're voluntary generally, involve face-to-face interaction, and usually not kin. But they can be, sometimes a cousin is a best friend or something of that nature, but generally they're not related. So the question that anthropologists began asking years ago is friendship universal? And maybe, maybe not. There's 2 factors that make it difficult to answer that question. The first is that there's not enough research to know, actually, cross-cultural research. And the second is, how do you define friendship on a cross-cultural basis? That makes it very difficult. So we don't know for sure, but some form of people coming together that are not kin, we think, is a cultural universal. So what are the social characteristics of friendship? There's an interesting culture, I think it's a Culturama or box on in this section, big page, on the amigo relationship among men in southern Spain. And they have very close and intense relationships as a male-to-male friendship. They're called amigos. But the really important friends, and there may only be one in each other's lives, is called an amigo de verdad, which is, friends of truth, and or a friend of truth. And those are the friends that you share your deepest secrets with, and there's no fear of betrayal ever with those friends. So friends are made out of, and you can read the whole section, it's really quite interesting. Friends are made on a voluntary basis, obviously, I guess, but who qualifies for friendship may be culturally constructed. So, for example, there may be gender segregation, or there may be cultural norms that prevent cross-gender friendships and promote same-gender friendships. Now, I wanted to remind you here about Arab men and also East Asian, Indian men who are very close friends, and you will see them walking around holding hands together in public and that type of thing, which led to, I've said this before, a lot of misunderstanding in Western cultures. And there's famously the photo of George W. Bush walking with the Saudi prince holding hands. Those are deep male gender-to-gender friendships. You would never see those kind of friendships cross gender lines in those cultures, with a male to a female having a close friend. And then racial segregation is another barrier that might prevent, culture constructed barrier might prevent people from becoming friends, especially in areas like the South and that type of thing. So another characteristic of friends is that they're supportive of one another. They're supportive psychologically, emotionally, and sometimes even materially. Sometimes they will help you out in some way. You can come and stay at my place till you find a place to live, that type of thing. And sharing stories is often the basis for friendship. In that Guyana men's study, in the text, the men who are friends in a group have all known each other since childhood. And they tell stories about the village history and their, funny experiences and things. They've probably all heard them 100 times, but that's a bonding kind of talking that friends do. An interesting study was done about friendship among the urban poor in the United States. And the study was done in one of the very poorest areas in New York State. And what they found was that friendship networks actually provided a form of economic survival among low-income African-American families, that there were extensive networks of friends, and as your book says, I'm quoting, supporting and reinforcing strategies for survival. So especially the women in the study area maintained a set of friends through what's called exchange and swapping of various goods and like food and clothing, that type of thing, sharing child care, sometimes loaning money back and forth if one of them had it and the other didn't, etc. Gifts and favors go back and forth over time, and that bound those friendships together. They were obligated to one another, but in a good way, in that they could call on each other in times of need. So the research demonstrated how friendship can flourish rather than break down in times of need and survival, and that people strategize and cope around those issues of survival through social ties. Once again, this is often stated, the more isolated you are, the fewer social ties you have, the less resources you have to fall back on or count on. So what's the downside of friendship? Well, you can't be friends with everyone, as the book points out. So there are in-groups and out-groups with friends, and bullying and, viciously excluding someone, that type of thing can occur as well. So now we're going to go through different, we started with friendship as a social group. Now we're going to go through some other more formal ones. So clubs and fraternities / sororities we're going to look at here. Those are groups, clubs and fraternities and sororities are social groups that define membership in terms of a shared identity and objectives. Okay. Often what gets involved is the same ethnic heritage, the same occupation, the same business, religion, or gender. Those are often bases around which people form clubs and other formal social groups. So they're ostensibly about sociability, but they often have economic and political roles as well, because you meet people in them that can help you or tell you about a job that's happening or a variety of other things. So looking at the women's clubs in Suriname that they used in the textbook, there were they had multiple functions. They served many purposes, the women's clubs, and this is true in other parts of Latin America as well, but they did the study in Suriname. So they raised funds to sponsor special events. They supported each other's individual celebrations. They helped meet personal and financial needs of members. Sent cards and flowers to funerals. Now, these are formal clubs that are organized as clubs, not friendships. They attended each other's birthday parties and death rites as a group. And they provided psychological support, entertainment, financial help. I think I mentioned that already. And there was a political aspect to it, too, because the members in the club usually belonged to the same party and attended rallies and events together, political rallies and events together. And that's important because political interest groups, which these clubs were, can affect or influence outcomes of elections and things of that nature. So now looking at college fraternities and sororities, this is not a very happy section, but we'll go through it. You can, hope you read the full descriptions in the text. So there are explicit purposes for fraternities and sororities and implicit functions. So let's look at the explicit functions. To form bonds between graduates, that helps to obtain jobs, right? However, in male fraternities can be very problematic, as you know from reading this section. So lots of studies have been done on them, and particularly on the initiation rituals and how male bonding, to quote your text and the researchers, male bonding is solidified by victimization and by the ridicule or rape of women. It's also, I have to add, reinforced by the victimization of males through hazing rites that occur in male-to-male hazing rites of new recruits in fraternities. So, but that victimization / often rape of women is rarely prosecuted among fraternities, and it reinforces a male sense of privilege, power, and unity with one another. Now, if you look in the Amazon, this is interesting because it's going to move on to something else here. It's even worse in those groups. The men's houses, there are, in many indigenous cultures, particularly in jungle areas for some reason of the world, South America especially, jungles, there are men's houses that only the men, that's where they go and they hang out and they smoke and they talk and they do whatever they do in the men's houses. And they're totally verboten to women, totally off limits in all of those cultures, but some are more intense than others. So they're talking about in the Amazonian rainforest, the men's houses are fiercely guarded from being entered by women. And if women attempt to do so, although why they would, I don't know, because they know that they'll be fiercely punished, as they point out. And rape's part of that punishment sometimes. So what's the cultural interpretation of that anthropologists and psychologists have explored, and what the conclusion kind of is about that behavior is that Amazonian men have a very high degree of anxiety about their identity as fierce warriors, because the Amazonian males are well known to have that persona, that identity as fierce warriors and as sexually potent males. That's how they present themselves. That's how they think of themselves. That's their front, okay? And having that involves taking an aggressive position in relation to women to prove you're those things. Interestingly, because we don't want any false equivalencies here, like we have so many floating around in our culture now, women don't form what are called androphobic, andro-male phobic hating, androphobic man-hating, or anti-male clubs. We've not found a culture anywhere where there are women's clubs or societies that parallel what I just described in the Amazon and other cultures, but they're using the Amazon as an example. So that would be the logical parallel behavior to gynophobic, women-hating, anti-male men's clubs, anti-female men's clubs, but it doesn't exist anywhere, including in college sororities, which are not mirror images of fraternities. There are some initiation rituals that may be psychologically brutal and bonding among the women, but none of them involve abusive behavior towards men. None of the rituals as opposed to in the male fraternities. So now we're going to look at countercultural groups. Countercultural groups, you might think of the hippie movement is more properly termed the countercultural movement that occurred in the 1960s. And that's the example that the text gives you too. They're groups that resist conforming to the dominant cultural pattern. A counterculture is against the culture, the tune in, turn on, drop out, famous Timothy Leary thing. It was like, I'm not going to be like my father and wear a suit and go to work every day and come home at 6 and drink cocktails with my bored wife and, et cetera, et cetera. It was a rejection of all of that. So it was counter to all of that. There are other countercultural movements. Motorcycle gangs, for instance, are countercultural in that they don't buy into the norms of society either and reject them all, So now we're going to look at youth gangs. Youth gangs, there's been so much research done with youth gangs. And if any of you are interested in sociology or anthropology, it's a very interesting subject to do more research in. If you ever have to write a paper or anything of that nature in a sociology class, or I suppose even a criminal justice class, because there's just tons of work done in this area. So what are youth gangs? They're a group of young people, mainly in urban areas, who are often considered a social problem, oh yes, by adults and law enforcement. And they are not only considered, they are, if they're, murdering each other or stealing or, whatever, selling drugs. So they vary in terms of how formally organized they are, but generally in youth gangs, there is a recognized leader. There are formal rituals of initiation, and there are symbolic markers of identity, where tattoos, colors, various things, of that nature, special clothing. So there's an example in your text, the Masta Liu in the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. Then they don't have any formal leader. They were giving you an example of a gang that has no formal leader. They're just a bunch of unemployed youth who migrated from the countryside to the city looking for work, only there is no work. So they bum around, they live with, some of them live, if they have relatives in the city, they live with them. Others all live together in large households of a bunch of these kids together at loose ends, and they can pool a little bit of money they have maybe to stay in wherever they're staying. And they just spend their time wandering around town in groups of as large as 10. They stand around and look in shop windows and in electronics stores, and it was kind of sorry to read about. They look at cinema posters, but they have no money to go into the movie theater. Um, they're not really doing any harm per se, but I'm sure you can understand that there were groups large of young men wandering around with no money, nothing to do, no jobs. It would be very disconcerting in a small city. Now, street gangs we're all more familiar with in America, and there's certainly a much more formal variety of youth gang than what we just talked about. There are leaders, there's a very strict hierarchy of membership roles and responsibilities, both. Um, and gangs have names, their members mark their identity, as we talked about above, in a variety of different ways. And they're not all involved in violence. So they did some research among 40 gangs in New York, LA, Boston, to find out why people joined gangs. The common perception, the kind of common knowledge, is that young boys join because they're from homes with no male authority figure with whom they can identify. So this was very popular quite a few years ago politically, to blame gangs on African American single mother households. That's what was causing it all. Well, it turns out when they do the research, about half of the boys in gangs or young men in gangs were from intact nuclear households with a mother and a father. So that blew that theory out of the water. If 50% of them are from nuclear households, that can't explain the whole phenomenon, right? Another common perception is that the gang replaces a missing feeling of family, but the same number, 50% of the gang members reported having close family ties. Then why join? Why did they join? Well, many had a particular personality type called a defiant individualist. This is so interesting. We get into a little bit of psychology as well as sociology and anthropology here. So what are the 5 characteristics of a defiant individualist? Well, you have intense competitiveness, mistrust of others, self-reliance, social isolation, and a strong survival instinct, okay? And I would say social isolation is a very important part there. Intense competitiveness, for instance, can lead you to great success in the world, right? Okay. Self-reliance can as well. So can a strong survival instinct. Those could be interpreted as positive characteristics, but mistrust of others and social isolation are not. So it's quite interesting to think about that, and how defiant individualists, how are they created or made, if you will, as children, or socialized to be that as children. So a structural view suggests that poverty, especially in urban areas, leads to the development of this kind of personality. For one thing, there's a huge amount of stress living under those situations. Stress can affect hormonal changes in a child's brain, which can lead to developmental issues and a variety of other things. So the structural issue is that poverty, especially in urban areas, leads to the development of the defiant individualist. It's such great terminology. Think about those words, defiance and individualism, that kind of personality, which is a reasonable response to economic obstacles and uncertainty. So there's been a global spread of youth gangs because due to very widespread economic changes in urban employment opportunities. Remember, we talked about those young men in Suriname who moved from the country where historically there was farming and moved into cities where they thought they were going to get jobs, and then there's too many people moving to cities and not enough jobs in many of the countries, poorer countries of the world. So people move for economic opportunities, young people, but then there aren't any when they get there. So, in fact, many countries around the world have a declining urban industrial base, and that has created permanent poverty in many inner cities globally around the world. People living in garbage dumps. I'm sure you're familiar with that type of thing. And this is all happening while at the same time, the media and schools are promoting this aspirations for a better life. And so you have this cognitive dissonance between what you're being told you're supposed to be doing and what the opportunities are and what the reality is, which is living in a garbage dump. Okay. So gang members, from a structuralist viewpoint, are victims of forces beyond their control. This creation, as I just said, of a desire for a successful life while denying anyone the legal means to actually obtain it. That is relevant in America as well. Okay. And what are the social conditions? What happens is then you have to change those interests and skills into illegal pathways. There's so many illegal pathways I could mention, but I mean, drugs are the one that we think of the most, I guess, with gangs, but there are plenty of other businesses and, fencing and, prostitution and all of those things. So you take any of these aspirations to make more money and things that you've been inculcated with, you can't do it a legitimate way, so you find an illegitimate way to do it. Now, interestingly, because I'm sure many of you have piercings and tattoos, and I have piercings too, the next group that they talk about is body modification groups. You may never have thought of that as a countercultural group in the United States, but it is. It definitely is. It was so rare, and looked down upon. The only people that had tattoos for years in American culture were sailors, pretty much, or people in the military. And they were never obvious. They were always usually on a bicep or somewhere, where you didn't see them if someone was wearing a long sleeve shirt. So I remember when tattoos and piercings started becoming more prevalent in the culture, and there was a lot of pushback to it. You couldn't get jobs, you couldn't do a variety of things, depending on the job, but one where you were in public, the presentation of self in public, etc. So that's changed a lot. But what the research shows is that the prominent motivation, or one of the main motivations for people doing body modification, is the desire to identify with a specific group of people. Now that's interesting, I think, very much so. Another form of social group are cooperatives, and there's a film about a women's cooperative for you to look at, and there's also something about gangs in the class. So a cooperative is a form of economic group in which the surpluses are shared among the members, and the decision-making follows the democratic principle of each member having one vote. So food co-ops work that way. You become a member, usually there's a small fee to become a member, and then you get a profit-sharing check at the end of a year or so. It's usually not very much, but something. You can serve on the board of directors and hire and fire managers and a variety of other things. So that's how cooperatives work. And so the most common worldwide are agricultural cooperatives and credit cooperatives. So many people I do belong to a bank that's a credit union, and that's a cooperative type of thing. They're not making a profit, a credit union. They're just, they're paying their help and all of that, but there's no big profit like a Bank of America or US Bank or something. And then one of the most growthful of all types of groups in recent years has been, not surprisingly, self-help groups. And worldwide, as well as in the US, there's a proliferation of them. So, those are groups formed to achieve specific personal goals, whether those are goals that have to do with substance abuse or coping with illness and bereavement, lifestyle changes, which is all, obviously also substance abuse, exercise, weight loss, etc. So increasingly, those groups, even before COVID, were using the internet to form virtual communities. And there's just been a very large proliferation of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous around the world. But they talk about especially this proliferation in Mexico and Latin America. But globally, membership in those groups is growing by about 10% a year, which is quite large. And so it's been interesting because AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, as your text points out, was a model of very middle class American self-help group. And yet it's been adopted worldwide and it's been culturized in different ways as the rather than being middle class, the study in Mexico that was in your text is about low income men in Mexico. So it's been generalized and proliferated and moderated, and that often happens with various kinds of social groups. So next week we're going to look at social stratification and get into that then. Oh no.